All right, let's jump right into this one. Today, we're looking at a truly fascinating study of early Islamic history. We're going to give you a full summary of an incredible deep dive done by the channel Events and History, and you can find their link right below in the description box. So this study actually questions one of the most widely accepted dates in world history. We're going to set aside later traditions for a moment and rely entirely on the earliest available evidence, just to see what the physical record actually tells us.
We're basically treating this study like a historical cold case. Here is our agenda for the investigation. First, the traditional Hijra narrative, then silence in the 7th century, clues in early inscriptions, the Byzantine-Sasanian connection, the Abbasid redaction theory, and finally, weighing the historical record. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The traditional Hijra narrative, the accepted timeline. Okay, so the standard historical narrative places the Hijra, which is Muhammad's famous migration from Mecca to Medina, in 622 AD. This marks the absolute foundation of the Islamic calendar. Whenever you see a date with AH or after Hijra, it's anchoring right back to this exact geographical movement in the 7th century. It's the defining moment shaping the timeline of early Islam. And, understanding if it actually happened exactly as told, well, that fundamentally changes how we view world history today.
But the researchers pose a super provocative question here. What happens to our timeline if this massive foundational event doesn't appear in any evidence from the actual 7th century? Think about it. As a historian, when an entire calendar is based on one specific event, you'd expect to find a huge paper trail, or at the very least a trail of stones and coins, right? Section 2. Silence in the 7th century, the missing evidence. And this brings us to a glaring historical void identified by the source channel when they examined the period immediately following 622 AD. Because when the researchers isolated their search strictly to the 7th century, literally stripping away all the text written hundreds of years later, they found a pretty startling silence.
The source argues that outside of later Islamic traditions, there is a total absence of contemporary hostile sources, physical archaeology, or even explicit Quranic references supporting this Mecca to Medina migration. In fact, they note there is not a single piece of 7th century archaeological proof in the Hijaz region, which is the central part of Arabia, that corroborates this massive exodus.
Furthermore, the few external sources that do exist early on, like the Chronicle of Theophanes, actually contradict the traditional narrative. As noted by the study, this 9th century text places Muhammad traveling to Jerusalem, which is hundreds of miles to the north, rather than making a localized migration way down in the Arabian Peninsula.
Section 3. Clues in early inscriptions, reading the stones and coins. So if the traditional texts are silent or completely contradictory, we have to look to the hard, physical evidence from the earliest caliphs. Because, well, while paper and oral traditions can easily be altered over time, stone and metal are much harder to argue with.
Now, what's absolutely crucial here is the specific wording. The first Umayyad Caliph, Muawiyah, dates an official inscription, which actually starts with a cross, by the way, to 622 AD. But he completely omits the word Hijra, simply calling it the year according to the Arabs. The researchers point out something really interesting. If the Hijra was the defining religious event for this calendar, why on earth would a caliph, just 4 decades later, fail to use the term entirely?
Similarly, let's look at the earliest known coin bearing Muhammad's name. It was minted over 60 years after 622 AD, yet it skips the Hijra completely too. Instead, it uses this incredibly cryptic phrase, after the believer's case has been settled. So neither the stones nor the coins from this foundational era mention a migration between Mecca and Medina.
Section 4. The Byzantine-Sasanian connection, the alternative 622 AD. So if 622 AD wasn't the year of a religious migration, what globally significant event happened that year to make it the anchor of the Arab calendar? To answer this, the researchers basically widen the lens to look at the massive geopolitical struggles happening in the Middle East at that exact time.
The researchers point to the massive Byzantine-Sasanian wars. I mean, a true clash of empires. They note that while the Persians conquered Jerusalem in 614 AD, the year 622 AD was precisely when Emperor Heraclius launched a crushing counterattack against them, ultimately leading to a Byzantine victory at Nineveh in 627. 622 AD was the ultimate turning point in this colossal conflict, a conflict against an empire that had oppressed Arab populations for decades.
The study links this geopolitical earthquake directly to Surah 30 in the Quran, suggesting Arab Christians rejoiced as the Byzantines defeated their Persian oppressors. The text clearly shows an awareness of the Roman or Byzantine defeat and a prophecy or observation of their eventual victory. This perfectly aligns with the historical reality of the 622 AD Byzantine pushback.
So the crucial takeaway here is that the source argues that phrase, the believer's case being settled, found on those early coins, refers directly to this newfound Arab independence from Persian rule far north of Mecca. Under this alternative timeline, 622 AD is celebrated because it is the literal birth of Arab political autonomy, an event that united different tribes against a common oppressor.
Section 5. The Abbasid Redaction Theory, Rewriting History. And this brings up the next massive piece of the puzzle. If 622 AD was originally about a Byzantine victory and Arab independence up north, how in the world did it transform into a story about a religious migration down south?
Well, the source claims that when the Abbasids took power and defeated the Umayyads in the 8th century, they systematically eradicated older Umayyad history to legitimize their own rule. By moving their capital to Baghdad, the Abbasids needed to suppress the northern origins of Arab power that favored their Umayyad rivals. So around 758 AD, Caliph al-Mansur commissions a writer named Ibn Ishaq to draft an entirely new historical narrative from scratch.
To create this new narrative, the researchers argue that the Abbasid biographer Ibn Ishaq heavily modeled Muhammad's life on biblical tropes, literally turning a geopolitical date into a religious exodus. To make their prophet resonate with an audience already familiar with Judeo-Christian history, elements were directly mirrored. Biblical Moses has an exodus fleeing Egypt, Muhammad has a Hijra fleeing Mecca. Biblical Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey, Muhammad enters Medina on a donkey.
According to the study, this redaction was so incredibly thorough that later Islamic scholars, like al-Bukhari, threw out a staggering 98% of early oral traditions. Think about that for a second. Out of hundreds of thousands of accounts, they effectively erased the original 7th century context, keeping only the tiny fraction that supported the newly established, Abbasid-approved narrative centered on Mecca and Medina.
Section 6. Weighing the historical record. Two competing timelines. Now, let's pull all of this together and objectively weigh the two timelines presented in this investigation. It's time to lay the evidence side by side.
On one side, we have the traditional narrative, 9th century texts detailing a religious migration in the south between Mecca and Medina. On the other side, the alternative timeline, 7th century physical inscriptions and coins pointing toward northern Arab independence following a Byzantine victory. The researchers are essentially asking us a profound question. Should we trust texts written hundreds of years after the fact by a conquering dynasty, or the contemporary stones, coins, and geopolitical records from the very century in question?
The source even suggests that early calendar references to the moon might be remnants of much older regional traditions, which further complicates the origins of the standard narrative. They point out that the Arabic word for month has Aramaic roots simply meaning crescent moon, pointing to ancient regional practices that entirely predated the concept of a hijra.
So, as we wrap up this study, we want to leave you with this final thought to investigate for yourself. Does the traditional account remain unshakable, or does this alternative timeline actually do a better job of explaining the physical evidence left behind? Remember, we are just impartially reporting the claims brought forth by the researchers. The ball is entirely in your court to weigh the evidence. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.